I'm Chavatiro Samuelson. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. I'm also the Regents Professor of History, and Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism. If you've been with us in previous programs, you already know that the Center for Jewish Studies is a unique hybrid of an academic program and a research center. We serve as intellectual resource for all aspects of the Jewish experience by offering undergraduate and graduate courses, research conferences, public lectures, and historical exhibits. Jewish Studies at ASU fosters critical inquiry about the past and an invitation to be engaged in the study of the present. For example, on Sunday, we held a conference via Zoom, of course, on Jewish-Muslim relations through the ages, and those who attended it could see how knowledge about the past is critical to flourishing life in the 21st century and to constructive relations between Jews and non-Jews. This academic year, we want to highlight the original work that we've been doing on Judaism and science here at ASU. The relationship of religion and science is one of the distinctive features of the Center for Jewish Studies. We are the home of the Judaism Science and Medicine Group, or as we call it, JSMG in short. And this organization was founded in 2008 to foster constructive relations between Judaism and the sciences. JSMG, as we call it, has now about 250 members, and the major activity is the annual conference, usually in either late March or April. Our last conference was on Judaism and climate change. Of course, we had to do it by Zoom. And our forthcoming conference will be on March 27, 2022, and will be devoted to Judaism and pandemics. So JSMG consists of Judaica scholars, scientists, physicians, health professionals, and educators, and the conferences are open to the public. In addition to this annual conference of JSMG, we wanted to feature individual faculty members of Jewish Studies who are engaged in research on religion and science. On October 5th, Professor Adam Cohen delivered the first lecture on religion and psychology with a focus on the issue of trust, on religion and trust. This evening, Professor Paul Cassell will shed light on the relationship between Judaism and evolutionary science. And I assume he will say something maybe about anthropology and perhaps system theories. Professor Paul Cassell holds a PhD from Boston University in religion and science. That's in 2012. He's trained in religious studies and philosophy of religion, in science and religion, in history and philosophy of science, and in cognitive science and neurolinguistics. He was recruited to ASU in 2012 as a postdoctorate fellow of the Center for Jewish Studies. And the purpose was precisely to help me to build interest in religion and science at ASU. And that's exactly what has happened since. After being at the center for 2 years, he became a fellow of the Honors College, and then since 2017, a lecturer at the College of Integrative Sciences and Arts. His courses, which are distinctly interdisciplinary courses, focus on religion and human evolution, on the theory of emergence, and on relationship between the natural and supernatural aspects of the human experience. Dr. Cassell is the author of Religion, Emergence, and the Origin of Meaning, Beyond Durkheim and Rappaport, that came out in 2015. And the book argues that religion can be explained by appeal to natural rather than supernatural factors, but that the meaning of natural, whatever we mean by natural, should be broadened to include the experience of human subjectivity. He has also contributed a chapter to the Routledge Handbook on Evolutionary Approaches to Religion, and he published other articles on religion and evolution, which is exactly the topic of his lecture this evening. So I will turn off my microphone and my video so we can all listen to Professor Paul Cassell. Paul, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Troyer-Samuelson. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be a part of the Jewish Studies community. I would not be at ASU if it was not for Jewish Studies at ASU, and thank you for bringing me here. Tonight, I get the privilege of laying out some of the main ideas that I sketched in a paper that I recently wrote that is in the Routledge Guide to the Evolutionary Approaches to Religion. And so my goal is to lay out the argument and try to focus on the key points that I felt like had the most, that were the richest for me to explore myself personally. What I'm after is an enriched understanding of religion in human history. And part of that depends on having a good definition, or at least a good working definition of religion to begin with. And so I wanted to just right up front explain what I think that would look like. So I'm going to share my screen here. So before even getting to that, my fundamental point tonight, and this is, I'm going to refer to this slide again and again, is that religion emerged as a system of interdependent parts, drawing on byproducts of prior hominin, early human, evolutionary innovations. Now, each line here is actually saying something in a conversation with other people, honestly. But the third point is resulting from the first steps taken towards symbolic culture and sociocultural systems. Probably during the, if you're interested in this kind of thing, the later Oldowan or early Trulian stone tool-making culture. So we're looking at millions of years ago. I'm not saying religion showed up millions of years ago, but the first steps towards symbolic culture and sociocultural systems were taken then, I believe, which produced hominin innovations. And part of the byproducts of those hominin innovations were elements that became a system of interdependent parts in what we now call religion. So if you look at the slide, I'm kind of working my way from the bottom up to make sense of it. So again, though, I need to have a definition of religion in order to get ourselves off the ground. And the one I'm using, I've drawn extensively from prior work, basically focusing on the work of Jewish scholars, Emil Durkheim and Roy Rappaport. Together, they have a very rich understanding of religion and its role in human life. And I have revised it and tweaked it somewhat, but I'm very much indebted to both of them for my own thinking about the nature of religion. And if I had to sum it up in a few buzzwords, it would be something like ritual and myth together produce personally meaningful experiences of something that I'm just going to label transformation right now. At the same time, it produces a robust, meaning a long-lived and adaptive social form. So personally meaningful experiences and a robust, long-lived and adaptive social form becoming entwined in a self-reinforcing set. And a picture that I've used over and over again, I don't know, even in my recent article, is this one. And to me, this is one of the best pictures of what I am trying to communicate about the nature of religion, and therefore what I'm trying to explain as I'm talking about religion's origins. Here you see someone who's cupping their hands as if they're going to catch something. And you see, if this was a video, you would see these people moving in a circle around some holy relic, some centerpiece. And this event, the Hajj, is the highest moment in Islam. It's the most important thing that all good Muslims should do. And it captures this idea that something intensely and personally meaningful is connected to something gigantically, heroically, socially robust. This has been going on without stopped on a yearly basis for 1,300 years. And other religious traditions, of course, have rituals that go back much longer than that. But here we see those two elements intertwined with each other. And the logic of this, I try to picture as something like this. This is this idea of mutual co-facilitation. What's happening in one domain is reinforcing what's happening in the other, and vice versa. And so for me, seeing the personal and the social intertwined, what we're talking about there are things that are supporting the continued existence of the other. Each supports the existence of the other over long periods of time. And this would just be a way to kind of picture that. So that's where I'm coming from if I want to explain what religion is. I want to explain something about the idea of transformation, as I mentioned up here, and something about the robust sociality and how it became self-reinforcing. Now, to do this, I'm going to have to go back and look at a long period of human evolution. Now, don't worry about the slide yet, because what I want to talk about, this is just a foretaste of, is that the period that I discussed, going back 2 to 1 million years ago, approximately, the dates are obvious, you know, they're loose. What's significant about this period is the way a very specific, significant cultural innovation developed, which fundamentally changed the nature of early human. Hominin is just, I'll use that word a lot, it just simply means early pre-human, pre-Homo sapiens, but in the line of human. Something happened in this period that redefined human social organization and human mental life at the same time. Now, what we see from this period is a set of wrought tools, and I've got 2 of them pictured here, that are used to do certain tasks. And what we see in the anthropological record is an almost unchanged use of these stone tools for about 800,000 years, which gradually gave way to a more complicated set of tools. Now, if you look at these tools here, they were not very complicated. They were not highly engineered, but the different shapes seem to have different functions. They were used differently. And if that's the case, this represents, simple as it seems, it represents a moment when human brains had to be capable of something like symbolic thought, and also to organize social practices according to the same mental abstractions. Now I'm going to unpack what I'm saying here, but something in this simple structure of 2 tools doing different things represents the beginning of a revolution in human thought towards something that we might call symbolic thought, and that allowed early humans to organize their social life around those mental abstractions that were shared among them. Now, by the end of this period, by the end of the 2.3 to 1.3 million period, much more interesting skills requiring high degrees of intentional practice were necessary to make the highly specific tools that were then coming out of that period. So we see a long period of simple tools that represent sort of the starting point of a new kind of thinking, eventually turning into much more sophisticated tools, which are called the Trulian Tools kit here. Then hand axes are kind of the key idea, but they also had cleavers, choppers, and scrapers. So one clue here that I want to point out is that if we're to now able to look back and see an unbroken tradition of these tools growing more complex and varied, my argument is that the skills and the practices, as well as the intentions, meaning the purposes behind those skills and practices, had to be successfully passed on from generation to generation. You're not going to see tools that are clearly being used for a purpose gradually changing into more sophisticated versions unless not just the skills, but the intentions for transmitting the skills are being passed on from generation to generation. Now, what I'm arguing this simple thing that I've just outlined represents is our capacity to become creatures who are connected to each other by ritualized, symbolically pregnant cultural memory. Now, what you see here is a picture of probably some sort of dance recreating something, possibly a hunt of some sort. Now, this would be an extremely advanced version, much later down the evolutionary tree. But my argument is that what we saw in that tradition of Oldowan stone tools, and then later a Trulian, more sophisticated tools, is something that led to this. It was a byproduct of it. And that's just going to be one piece of our key puzzle. This is what I'm proposing is the time period and the situation that created the conditions for the later emergence of religion. Now, I spent a lot of time in my recent research trying to make sense of how this might be, how something like this, as simple as it looks, can become something more sophisticated and then even in a later time represent something that we might recognizably call religion. And so I've kind of broken up the idea into a couple of stages that I think are logically necessary for that kind of development to occur. As you can see, my argument here is basically trying to create an inference to the best explanation for things. There's not a lot of hard evidence. I've got, I can show you in later slides, some hard evidence that we have of religion showing up, but it's much later. So anything we're doing at this time period is very speculative, but it's based on building backwards from what we do know and figuring out what must have been the case to get us to that point as best we can, using the best available evidence that we have. So one, how do we go, what do those stone tools represent? Even the simplest stone tools that are used as choppers and scrapers. Well, for one, they represent something like shared abstract categories. And the best analogy that I can come up with that might kind of be a picture of what was going on in that early period is to consider what someone who is training someone else to take over a job has to pass on when they're using, for example, color-coded folders to represent different types of work. And so what I have on my left is 3 different colored folders, and on my right, work that is in different stages of completion. The green represents work that is currently being done. The gray represents work that has been completed, and the blue represents work that is to be done in the future. Now, if you are trying to train someone into taking over that position, each worker has to not just see the superficial idea of putting papers into folders, but they have to see the pattern that each distinction in color on the left in terms of the folders, that each distinction in color corresponds to a similar tripartite distinction in the status of the work. The folders and the work we can't just repeat a practice of putting paper into folders. We have to actually catch the coordination, the abstract categories being used in order to coordinate that work. Now I kind of, well, so that's the key analogy that I want to work for. Each occupant of the role has to get the high-level abstract connection and to adapt it as their own system for the work to be passed on from occupant to occupant. Now, this task, what I've just described, something as simple as this, it's very simple to us now. We do it almost automatically without much thought. But this represents shared high-level abstract symbolic thinking that few animals can even demonstrate, let alone use in any productive way, but it's ubiquitous to human life. Now, similarly, chopping and scraping are two different tasks requiring two different tools. And to maintain a tradition of actively using two different tools to do two different tasks for 800,000 years suggests that these early hominins were sharing the symbolic or the relational connections between rock shapes and uses, and were actively engaged in producing the shapes for the purposes of those uses, and then passing on those symbolic categories from generation to generation. So an early first stage that I think we already see in the earliest Oldowan stone tool culture that I'm showing here, which would represent the oldest time period I'm looking at, represents something like shared abstract categories that multiple people are adopting and occupying roles in respect to over hundreds of thousands of years. But there's another stage that I think we see in this trajectory of Oldowan stone tool culture. And that is the beginnings of something that one thinker that's influenced me a lot calls skilled practice. And here, you don't have to look at each individual moment here, but this is a demonstration based on reproducing the marks on rocks of the kinds of steps necessary to produce that more sophisticated stone tool that I was pointing out in the earlier slides. It takes multiple steps done in a specific order. You can't cheat on the order. You have to maintain the order as well as the rationale for doing that order in order to produce the stone tools that were produced at the later period of this. Now, actually, I'm just deciding whether or not I'm going to take, I'm just going to go ahead to mention the next step. So skilled practice was clearly something that was being developed. Now, third, this is the next thing that I want to point to. Ritualized pedagogy, shared practices that are being passed on. Remember, this is prior to any kind of language. In fact, I would argue this is the roots of language, but it's prior to it. So what I'm talking about here is some sort of ritualized, embodied, physical sharing of a meaning system that both passed on the practices as well as the purposes for doing those practices. Now, studies have shown that even among modern humans, the ability to make these tools is very difficult to pass on without language. Even among modern humans, right? When you prevent them from talking about it, it's very hard to pass on. And so what almost certainly had to be the case is that these intentional practices had to be ritualized, where proper physical practice and imitation were emphasized. But as I've mentioned, at the same time, the mental connection between these different practices has to be passed on. The outcomes, right? If you're making a chopper, if you're making a scraper, if you're making a hand axe, those are tied to purposes. It's not just the practice that has to be passed on, but the reasons for doing so, which act as a constraint that allows imitation without a guiding purpose can easily get off track and become ornamental and go in a direction that is no longer intentional or it's no longer purposeful. And so the purposes have to be passed on as well as the practices. The physical practices basically had to mean different things to maintain their purposes in tool production. And there's a fourth element that I think we can extract from this early period of stone tool making. And that is this very easily could lead to embodied, meaning not oral, not using your voice, because that was a much, much later adaptation, but physically embodied symbolic communication in new contexts. What was happening for 800,000 years plus was developing the framework that allowed shared symbol systems and the means of communicating them physically to leap out of their context and stone tools to take on new roles and new purposes. And I just have this idea of different ways that physical embodied signs can take on symbolic meaning, right? We know what these things mean because they're part of a system of what hand gestures can mean. And I thought of a simple, just to make what I'm saying clear here, is if you're making stone tools and you're working on making choppers, for example, and you finish one, you take the parts and you put the choppers maybe on the left and you put the scrapers on the right. And the ones that didn't work out that you throw away, maybe you toss back over your head, right? Now, if you're in a system of doing this for long periods of time, those actions themselves begin to take on meanings in a symbolic context. To the left means something, to the right means something. Throwing something back over your head means something. And in a shared, tightly constrained system where making tools making tools requires that tightly constrained interrelational communication, it's very possible for you to adopt the idea of throwing something back over your head. This is pure speculation, by the way. No evidence for this. I'm just saying that motion can come to mean in a new context the idea that you need to throw something away. Now, maybe early on, it just means something like, someone's in a dangerous situation and what do you appeal to communicate in those moments? Well, if you have this idea that left means one thing and right means one thing and over your head means another, you can draw on that in a very simple way and communicate. But notice that the motion of putting your hand back, throwing something over your head, faking that motion, doesn't have any intrinsic meaning. Its meaning is found in the relations that were required to create those stone tools with the purposes that they had. So this is what this really represents, and of course this is highly speculative. Well, what I'm doing here is working on something that other people have tried to work on, but not satisfactorily. I'm trying to make progress in this idea of how a stone tool manipulation for long periods of time can lead to symbolic communication and symbolic culture. And so this is, for me, just this little piece that I did right now was the most satisfying part of my entire research for the last few years, because there's a lot here that to compel itself. It might not be ultimately right, and of course we need criticism and get other perspectives, but the idea here, there's enough power here that I feel like this represents a sort of a move forward to identifying when symbolic culture becomes significant. And when symbolic culture becomes significant, now we're talking about something very different. I believe that symbolic culture drove human evolution in new directions based on its power to organize individuals to complete tasks that otherwise would just be impossible. And so what I'm going to do to just give you a shorthand definition based on this explanation I gave is say, well, what is symbolic cultural memory? What I think it is aggregates of individuals using the same symbolically encoded map to navigate and coordinate common experience. And these are just simple examples that we use all the time, but the differences in color and the differences in markings on otherwise very similar things we use to coordinate common experience. Right? We know what that means. My dog does not, and probably could not it's debatable. That's a testable empirical thing that could be done, but it probably is above his pay grade. That's probably not something that he could figure out. But something as simple as doing that leads to something as complicated and representing the nexuses of literally thousands of lines of human thought and human interactions that leads to a situation like mission control, where the life sciences, where physics, where biology, where all the academic fields that go into chemistry, all sorts of things go into creating and launching humans into outer space. And right here, all this kind of represents the potential when we all share some and work together using the same symbolically encoded map to navigate and coordinate common experience. So I have now done my first part, or at least, for the purposes of this talk. And I will go as far in this talk as I can without violating my time constraints. Because I'm doing it in this order because for me, this was the most significant thing that I worked on in the last couple of years, and it sets the stage for everything else that I wanted to say. So in that time period, steps taken towards symbolic culture and sociocultural systems produced certain innovations. And now I want to describe what a few of those are. Okay, so now my interests here are the specific ways that this coevolution between brains and our social cultural systems and our symbol systems, there's sort of a coevolution that had to be going on, where the early versions of hominins working together using symbol systems started pushing evolution forward, where not only brains are starting to evolve, but symbol systems and sociocultural elements are all evolving together. It's driving evolution in a certain direction. But my interests are not in all of those, although at least for this talk. What I'm really focusing on is how it created the capacities that later became part of religious systems. So the three hominin innovations that were probably a result of living in and evolving within symbolic culture that I think were probably most important for being taken up later in religion is what I'm going to focus on here. So three dispositions and capacities implicit in symbolic culture that I think were important for religion. One is something that I'm going to call hyperactive pattern detection. Narratively based personal and social identities, and the production of theoretical entities. So the first one, hyperactive pattern detection. We are predisposed at birth to look for hidden patterns behind events. Like, for example, the pattern between the colored folders and the status of work done that I alluded to earlier, that I showed earlier. Why does that become so natural to us? Because we come in ready to look for hidden patterns that connect at a deeper level as we're learning language. It would be impossible for us to learn language without our predisposition to pattern detection, especially looking for unseen hidden connections underneath, which leads to our ability to sometimes see things as symbols, whether they are or not. And it's this predisposition that's so key to human language acquisition. So this is a 2.6 million year old stone that was carried a long way away from where it originated. No one knows for sure why, but you can look at it and at least make a guess that might not be right. But even if it's not right in this case, at some point in human prehistory, taking a stone like this would be significant because we would disregard all of the things that are not in common between that stone on the left and a human face and notice the human face in that stone. And it would represent that in some way. This second one is a painting I can't remember actually which cave it is, but it's tens of thousands of years old, where someone took the shape of the stones and put a human face on it, taking advantage of the nose and the protuberances there. But this ability to use language and to share symbol systems also gives us our social identities, our ability to tell stories, to have personal stories and to have stories about our group. Eventually, symbolic capacities allowed that to happen. And one of the cool things that symbolic reference does is because, as I mentioned, my hand motion of going back over my head representing throwing away junk, that motion can be removed from its context and used in new contexts. And the beauty of symbol systems is that they can be used to maintain relations between ideas apart from their connection to anything that's actually in the physical world. We can use symbolic reference to talk about things that have never been seen, including the possible, the impossible, the hoped for, the invented, the not there, and the posited or the promised. We can use the symbolic the capabilities of symbolic reference to sort of leapfrog into new areas that otherwise we wouldn't be able to think about, or if we could think about them, they would be so vague. But using symbolic reference allows us to pin those down. It's a great reinforcer of our ability to come up with theoretical entities. And I would just point out that all speculative thinking, whether it's purely for play, like science fiction or fantasy or children's games, or as speculation about ultimate or unseen causes, like, for example, in science or in mythological figures, all of those are rooted in this first capacity of hyperactive pattern detection, narratively based personal and social identities, and the production of theoretical entities, all made possible through symbolic reference and languages built on symbolic reference. So that's one of three dispositions I think is critical. The second I alluded to earlier, and that is embodied ritualized presentations like drama and dance, enacting models of social behavior without words. And on the left, notice I have a hunt, a coordinated hunt. And on the right, what might be a recreation of that. Some specific hunt recreated in a dramatic form, where each person has a different role representing that maps onto something that in an ideal way happened in that hunt. So my point is that the combination of physical synchronization and symbolic representation that the stone tools started was honed for hundreds of thousands of years and eventually became physically enacted dramatic presentations representing conceptual models of social behavior prior to oral language. We can represent the social past, the future, and the could be through narrative, drama, and dance. Mimed narrative and dramatic stagings of big game hunts, complete with masks and costumes, could have been made to celebrate past hunts and coordinate future hunts. And finally, a third disposition that I think was potentially, that was pregnant, it was pregnant in the period that I'm looking at, because it's an implication of symbolic culture. And as we evolve within it, these capacities surely have to have been developed. The cultural use of altered individual and group emotions and states of consciousness. Now, without going into too many details, what I'm looking at on the left picture is something called personality decentral. Now, this is perhaps something that happens as a result of participating in dramatic narratives where you're recreating or planning important social events like group hunts. If you're dressed like a lion for a long time, you can begin to take on a personal decentering where your own sense of self is kind of moved out of the way and you become the lion. This happens still to this day in drama, where actors will talk about roles that they've taken on, where by taking on the role, their own personality has been decentered, and they've become that person to some degree. And they can talk about it as if that's actually something that happens, that they've become like that person and unlike the way they were. But we're also talking about, like in this middle slide, biochemical manipulation. There was a writer a few years ago wrote about what he's calling the brilliance-prone spectrum of biochemical manipulation. And this can mean a number of things. It can mean literally chemicals. It can mean exploring alternate states of consciousness with chemicals, but it can also mean using darkness or using fire. All the things that we probably were doing for long periods of time tend towards dopamine production and other things that this author is talking about, calling the brilliance-prone spectrum. And these might suggest strange but salient metaphysical ideas, right? It's the exploration of possibility that can be explored through these means. And finally, I'm arguing that something like personal and interpersonal blurring, what have often been called dance states, where we become entrained in dance and other synchronous movements, possibly utilizing drums. All of these are things that are the cultural use of altered individual and group emotions and states of consciousness. And I believe this also became a possibility in that time period because presupposed to all of these is the beginnings of senses of self are developing. As you can use language to pivot off of, I don't have time to go into this too much depth, but I believe that there's a strong possibility that you have to have some sense of conscious self that is enabled by symbolic capacity before you can have these kinds of decentering sort of experiences that seem significant in some way, because they seem different in some way. They seem other than the norm. And so what I'm suggesting at this point is that I've talked about the first step and I've talked about the second, that we are drawing on byproducts of prior hominin innovations. None of these three things are religion in themselves. These are things that I think are byproducts. These are hominin innovations that came from evolving within symbolic culture and can be used in an eventual religious package. And so that's the last thing I want to say, just because I respect the time here and I appreciate your time and I don't want to go too far. If you read my abstract, I talk about the importance of the divine, the concepts of the divine. And I'm not going to get into it here just because I am running out of time. But the point that I would like to make is that it's not a big leap between hyperactive pattern detection, narratively based personal and social identities, and the production of theoretical entities to come to the idea of mythological beliefs. I had this slide here, just the technology of biochemical manipulation, where someone at night is sitting in front of fire and the dopamine, brilliant prone spectrum, thoughts that aren't normal, aren't pragmatic day, sunlight thoughts. These are nighttime thoughts, is connected to a mythology. And part of what allows us to do that, are these hyperactive our abilities, our symbolic capacities. Another transformation is that embodied presentations like drama and dance, an act, what I was just looking at a minute, can become religious ritual. And finally, the cultural use of altered individual and group emotions and states of consciousness can become something different. Religious transformation, where there is an ideal in mind. There's a goal to the experience. The idea isn't just to have an experience, but to be transformed into something. And I would say that that's true for each of these three transformations. What's on the left is sort of generic, but what's on the right is specific to religion. And because it involves something a little bit more. Okay, Hava, I need you to jump in for a second because I'm at 45 minutes and I've got maybe a few more slides to do, but I could stop here because I've said a lot. I don't want to overwhelm anybody or the time that I've been given.
Yeah, that's okay. You can finish your talk. We're good.
Okay, all right, thank you. So where I'm going for is how three dispositions and capacities became religion. So my argument here is that speculative conceptions of ultimate causes, what I was describing as number one, those speculative conceptions of ultimate causes can easily become drawn upon to explain what I'm calling the mysterious elements of the latter two. The other things that I think were innovations that have an element to them that are strange in some way. And by appealing to narratively produced conceptions of ultimate causes, we can then use those to explain the strange elements in these other two, which for me explains why they become packaged together into a system. And let me explain what I mean by that. So if you think about a couple of rituals, think about a religious ritual like the Catholic Mass that I was showing just a second ago. Or think about a presidential swearing-in ceremony, which is another kind of ritual that we all gather together to do corporately. Or think of a dramatic recreation of a big game hunt. Each of these ritual systems represents a kind of distributed authority where the effectiveness of the ritual comes because we all buy into it. We all cede authority to the same regimentation of our mental and social lives. For example, in a swearing-in ceremony, we're affected, or even the United States Constitution, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, there's a we the people that says when we're gathered together for this swearing-in ceremony, our participation is instantiating a social authority that is effective. We are declaring, and a president is becoming a president in a moment. It's not like there's anything that happened or I should say the most important thing that happened was our confirmation that this effect happened. We cede authority to that in that ritual performance to do certain things. And my point is that we the people, however you conceive of it, is an abstract entity. There is no we the people, there's only individual people. But as we have this abstract concept, we can create in our own mind, which we create in our own minds, we use that to explain the distributive authority of ritual participation and submission. My point being, there's a hole right in the middle of identifying the authority responsible for our submission to meaningful ritual. Where does the authority come from? when we gather together and a president becomes sworn in, or maybe a ship becomes the HMS Queen Elizabeth, right? Something is enacted in those moments, and it happens because we all allow that event to be authoritative for us. But that has a strange sort of sense to it of, of where is the authority actually lying? It's a question mark. So that, I think there's a mysterious element in the ritualized embodied presentations like drama and dance enacting models of social behavior. It's our working together that creates the authority of what we then benefit from as we have created that authority. It's what's called a performative. It doesn't happen, it happens because we perform it into being. But there's one other thing that also seems to have a mysterious element to it. And that's what I'm calling strange anomalous experiences and emotions, as I alluded to in an earlier slide. Those kind of events, dance states, I did a lot of work on the Grateful Dead, actually, in my dissertation, because I was very interested in the idea that among deadheads themselves, there was this sense that when they gathered and were in those dance states together, that there was this third thing that happened, that something strange and anomalous, and it was called within the dead community, the X factor. And some shows, oh man, we all got it. It really showed up. And other shows, yeah, maybe not. But the point being is strange anomalous experiences and emotions like those that occur in the brilliance prone spectrum, or those that occur in personal decentering, or those that occur in dance states and in the blurring of boundaries. They also have an anomalous sort of, a source of, what is the source of this? Where does this come from? So my point is that when these two sources of their question marks, and take the picture on the right representing the social authority of a swearing-in ceremony, where the authority is a performative that we all allow, we all create. Or think of what's going on the right-hand screen, where some sort of personally significant transformation is happening. When the same source is attributed to both of these mysterious elements, what I'm calling a theoretical, unseen, speculative cause for them, I think then we're seeing the birth of religion, at least according to the definition that I showed earlier. And I wanted to point that out, and this is my last two slides. What's going on here, and what's going on in the logic here, each begs a question. If you look on the picture on the right, it seems compelling, but of course we know that that can't actually happen, right? There's an unseen element, the author of the drawer, M.C. Escher in this case, who is actually the source of the coordination between those two, even though in the picture itself, it looks like those two are self-coordinated. And it's an analogy here, but on the left, both the social ritual element and the personally transformative element are coordinated at the same time by the same posited theoretical unseen cause of both. And because of that, these become interdependent. They become self-reinforcing to each other. So I know that's a lot. You can, if you want to wrestle with this in more length, you can read my article that's coming out soon, where I talk about this more at length. But I'm thinking that what is significant about these hominin innovations that we looked at earlier is that they all have a byproduct that sort of raises a question that can neatly be resolved through our potential to speculate about theoretical entities. And once that's done, it produces a very powerful system that then itself can evolve and change over time. And there's lots of theorists who have talked about how early religion can transform into other kinds of religion. I'm trying to take a step back and say, where did it come from in the first place? And I think what I've done in this talk, or at least to the best of my ability, I've talked about how symbolic culture and social cultural systems in the early period produced byproducts that led to a system of interdependent parts that we now call religion. That was a mouthful, and I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for doing so. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing, but I can turn this back on if necessary, in case people have an actual question about and they want to refer to a slide. I'd be happy to go back.
Terrific. Thank you, Paul. So we ask you, if you don't mind, to present your questions in the Q&A function. But if you can, Paul, look also into the chat. Maybe some people put stuff into the chat. But no, let's see, I can look at it also and see if there is something particular, but I don't see a particular question. So let me start with a question that may get us going here. You, as a kind of a anthropologist of religion, maybe we should call you. You give us kind of, as you said yourself, reverse engineering. We are trying to figure out how we got to the point that we have such a complex system we call religion. Now, everybody in the talk probably noticed the word God, the word theology, the word, all of the things, rather high symbolic moves that we make were not even mentioned. So it's almost like you can say, we don't need theology and we don't need belief systems in order to be religious or in order to act religiously. So how would you, if that's the case, how would you respond to a religious person who might feel put upon or upset with your anthropological evolutionary approach?
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful, wonderful question that I sort of anticipated, right? I felt like that is a natural response. And there's a couple of directions that I could go here, each of which I'll probably forget the other ones that I could have gone in. And so forgive me if I'm kind of scattershot responding to this. But so first of all, in a fundamental way, we have to define as humans, as religious believers, as participants in a tradition, what we mean by the divine in terms of its actual impact on our actual real world life experiences. We can speculate all we want about metaphysical sources of this or that, right? And people do. I mean, there's all sorts of metaphysical theories out there about what's ultimately true. Maybe we're in a, I'm on these feeds, an ASU feed, maybe we're in a simulation. Maybe this is just a computer simulation because, we know, right? That's a metaphysical speculation about reality. And the answer is, yeah, maybe we are, or maybe we're not. Or maybe Yahweh was responsible for the creation of the universe. Or maybe the Tao that cannot be named, an emanation of the Tao created reality. Or maybe, some other thing. But what matters, what turns it into something that is significant to us is when we cash out those ideas into something that impacts our social life and impacts our personal sense, our meaning systems. So an interesting way I've thought about this connection, it has important implications. So the question boils down to, yes, but are we talking about the dismissal of the divine here. So that even has two answers to it. But let me pull back and just say, it doesn't have to be the dismissal of the divine. We don't have to be talking about the dismissal of the divine here. There's a long history in science and religion discussions where we acknowledge the distinction between first primary causes and secondary causes, causes that are the proximate causes for something and things that are the ultimate causes for things. So even in the cognitive science of religion, there are plenty of people who would adhere to a religious perspective and who would defend what they're studying as sort of being godless by saying, we're not talking, look, we're in the natural world, we're in the physical world. There are going to be physical reasons for things that happen, or at least things that should fall under our understanding of what nature is all about. So that we shouldn't be appealing necessarily to supernatural for the cause, for the proximate causes, but there's still an open question about ultimate causes, right? That's sort of that's one move you can make, but a totally different move you can make, which is one that I'm actually more sympathetic, one that I've found more satisfying personally, let me just put it that way, is something like the idea that who I am as a human being right now, I don't doubt that I exist, and I don't doubt that in some ways I am not just my brain, even though I am clearly my brain. Mm-hmm. I cannot not be my brain. I can't even imagine. I was under anesthesia because of surgeries, and I don't think I existed outside of, in those moments. My brain was too shut down. I mean, who knows? Maybe I did, but I don't think, it sure didn't seem like it. But yet, when I am here, sitting here right now, I don't doubt that I am real, that I am something that is more than what I am reducible to. And that very intuition, I think, is very powerful for thinking about the nature of divinity within religious communities. Because the kind of dynamics that I've been outlining in this talk, I actually first saw in theories about the nature of human consciousness and theories in the nature of how biology is an emergent phenomenon. And what that got me thinking along the lines of was the right dynamics and the right organization seems to produce pretty amazing new things in our natural universe, including me and you sitting here right now experiencing this moment. When nothing in our brains is experiencing this moment, not a single neuron, to our knowledge, the best scientific knowledge, is experiencing anything. But yet here I am. And so I have kind of become enamored with this idea that divinity, the divine, in any particular religious tradition, can be something that emerges through the organization of the communities, through symbol systems, sociocultural interactions, and all of the things that I've been trying to, ritually structured authority, ritual and myth being authoritative in a community, can produce something that I think legitimately could be considered, at least in theory, right? It's a different potential move from thinking about primary causes and secondary causes, which kind of assume that the divine pre-existed the natural world. A different kind of local sort of embodied take that says the divine might emerge out of the natural world, just like I emerged out of the natural world, at least as far as I can tell. So that would be kind of two possible options that one might take to be responding to this naturalistic turn that I and most of the people in my field would take. So I think that's at least a good starting point for an answer there.
Yeah, let's go to the Q&A. Can you look at the questions and respond to them?
Actually, go ahead and read the question because no one else can see it.
Okay, so I'm going to try to go one by one, and I do see three. Well, first, what role do you think there's an acronym of HAD, hyperactive agency detection, which is, I think, what you're going for here. Oh yeah, you say that. plays into the predisposition to see conspiracies where they might not exist, whether that be blood libel, host desecration, etc. Is this why disinformation agents are currently trying to target religious communities disproportionately with conspiratorial thinking? Okay, now let me make one tiny correction. I'm not arguing hyperactive agency detection, which most people in my field look at. I'm arguing hyperactive pattern detection, because that's what's necessary, but that goes to your point. I'm just making a subtle correction just in case anyone was unclear about that. Hyperactive agency detection is a sort of this idea that you can have a fight or flight response to a flash, something moves to your right and you immediately go to agency. Something caused that because we've evolved in a world where we needed to be up on that kind of response. That's not what I'm describing. Some people would say, hey, that's the source of religious belief. I think that's a very impoverished view of what is going on. But something like hyperactive pattern detection, where we see symbolic thinking, is where we see the patterns when they're there, we are hyperactive at that. We're very good at that. And this goes directly to your point. I think absolutely it plays into our predispositions to see conspiracies where they might not exist. There is pleasure that we gain when we try to find and make hidden connections. The Jewish semiotician Umberto Eco's wonderful, oh boy, I can't think of the name of the book off the top of my head, but he's just done some wonderful play with this idea of conspiracy theories and how we can get so eager to think about them and to fall into them because it's like a sweet, we have a sweet tooth for it, right? And why is it disinformation targeting religious communities disproportionately with this kind of thinking? I would probably say that it has to do with the fact that the patterns that we see in language and language acquisition and the hidden patterns that we make in connections that we make in our daily lives that are really there. The ones in religion are clearly more tenuous on any understanding of religion. The kinds of experiences, the kinds of things that might lead the Jewish people to say, the Exodus, that was God. Right? That is something that happened. We use that as an emblem of the kinds of things that the divine can do. Well, those kinds of things are clearly more tenuous. They're not always adopted by everyone. And so people who have been impacted by religious traditions might have a tendency, and I wouldn't say might, probably do have a tendency to be more open to possibilities, but by the same token, less skeptical of being misled, right? It's a double-edged sword because you're never going to experience things that are really there to experience this if you don't give it a shot, if you're not willing to see if it's there. But by the same token, you can easily get blinded and easily get misled because you want to see what you want to see. And there's enough plausibility, superficial plausibility to address something. So I think you're right on with your thinking there, but I would want to spin it both ways. I would want to play it both ways and say, yes, I think that's true, but I also think it's what gives religion its potential to actually do something that truly is cultivating an engagement with something that is abnormal or bizarre in some ways. I'm a fan.
We seem to lose you. Paul,
He is stuck.
Great question.
Oh,
Thank you.
there he is.
Second
Okay,
question. I'll continue, maybe I'll figure it out. Oh, did you lose me?
Yeah, we lost you for a while. You were frozen, but let's go on to the next question.
Okay. Your view, as I understood, sees religion as a result of aggregates and evolution. You use the words predisposition a few times, which connects to the idea of the desire to connect to a potential nature, which is inherent in all individuals, which we can only achieve by the aggregation of minimal steps, which is a development in opposition to your view. What do you think of evolution as a race towards a we already feel we know? Okay, so one key idea here is clearly predisposition. The desire to connect to a potential in our nature, which is inherent. And I'm unclear of the idea of development in opposition to your view, because so forgive me if I'm not answering your question. I'm not quite sure I completely understand it. And if Hava, if you feel like you do better, if someone else does, feel free to stop me. But what I'm talking about is something that is often called scaffolding. It's the idea that you can create environments that allow potentials to grow and to develop. And the primary time I was talking about scaffolding or predispositions, or the development of predispositions, was when I gave it short thrift, but other authors have made this their entire life's work, is what happens when we become a symbolic species, when we become people who evolve and, or not just evolve, but who grow up within and pass on to our children and pass on to their children and their children, our life within a sociocultural community that is using symbolic reference to organize itself. The simple times we do that with stone tools create the conditions because of its usefulness, just by its pure usefulness. It puts selection pressure on individuals to evolve in a direction that makes that easier over time. The easier it is for us to enter into a sociocultural system that uses symbolic reference, the easier that system is to do the tasks that it needs to do. So there's it's called niche construction. It's like a beaver that creates dams so that its water, so that its capacities to live in water are fulfilled. We can create sociocultural identities that start off simple, but because of their usefulness, we can become adapted to them. And then as we become adaptive to them, we can start moving them in new directions. It's like an arms race where we get good at it, but that allows us to use it in a new direction, which we then get good at some more, which allows us to use it in a new direction. So our cognitive capacities to see symbols, where they are and sometimes where they're not, our capacities to work together in ritualized dramatic presentations, or at least in the past. We still do that, but in the past it was more significant. And our capacities to entertain and use alternate states of consciousness. I think those are all things that weren't there at the beginning, but because of this ratcheting, it's often called a ratcheting effect, where you turn it, but then it can't go back, and you click it and it can't go back. So a ratcheting effect is what I'm arguing led to this expansion of our cognitive capacities that opened the door for those three capacities that I talked about, which led, in my own thinking here, potentially could have led to a religious package. So I don't know if I answered your question completely, and my apologies to you if I didn't.
You did a good job. Let's go to the third question.
Okay. Thank you for a rich, fascinating talk. You're welcome. I was wondering about the place, if any, of mutual care in the evolution of religion, the desire to establish communities where individuals and perhaps group help and support each other. So what you're, within the evolution of religion is your question. So first, let me say that I think what we're talking about here is a biologically given capacity to care that for other, and evolutionary biologists might talk about how we evolved to care for our young, for example, right? It's good for our genes. Selfish genes create loving families is kind of the slogan that I've used to try to spin that idea. That's drawing on Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. Well, his point was never that we should be selfish. His point was that selfish genes create all the things that we value because we do it, because we can, we love our families, we pass on our genes. But the thing about the cognitive distance that symbolic thinking does, it allows us to apply categories that evolved in one domain to a different domain altogether. And it's very difficult to conceptualize how animals that are not related to each other can care for each other. And there are people working on mutual altruism and things like that. There are kind of tit for tat theories that come out. Well, if you scratch my back, I scratch yours, right? That's not really the care I think that you're talking about. You're talking about this kind of a care and compassion that is deeper, that religious traditions can cultivate. Well, Lee Kirkpatrick, who's one of the evolutionary theorists of religion that I draw upon, actually, talks about this very idea that it's no mistake that the words within many religious communities, the language of family is used as the predominant metaphor. Your brothers and sisters, right? Your parents, all of the within even Aboriginal traditions, right? It's this idea that we're engaging with our loved ones in the past. Right, and it's the idea of care that we might have evolved just like any other animal that cares for their young, but it's removed from its context because of our capacities. I didn't go into it, but the symbolic capacities require us to diminish the strength of our biological urges. One of the things that we're really good at, and we have a huge forebrain in order to do it, is to suppress things that our urges would want us to do, or that our natural habits or our patterns would want us to do. And that capacity to suppress urges is what frees us to connect things to each other that otherwise get lost in the passions of the moment. So that we, in our symbolic capacities, have developed the ability to not only suppress our urges, but to take them and put them in other places, to transmute what they are to some other thing. And I think religious traditions are, not only have they done that, because that is in, maybe for, you could argue that there's, well, a couple of thoughts in my head here at the same time. They have, in fact, it seems by looking at the anthropological record, adopted or sort of co-opted sort of that idea to use in other situations. But there's more to the story there as well, because I also think that there's an amplification of it as well, right? Religious traditions, by positing that the divine nature, for example, is ultimately a certain way, that is ultimately about care and concern for whatever, the environment, for people, for others. That when you couple that with the kinds of social dynamics that I've been talking about, and the kinds of transformation dynamics that I've only alluded to some of them, right? But this idea of transformation, it's different from having an experience. Transformation means moving towards an ideal. And when that ideal is care and concern and compassion, it can be a powerful motivation. And when decentering is involved, where you can take on in Christian terms, the life of Christ, or the sages in most religions they've done this, right? They've been pictured as doing this. It can draw on the depths of possibilities that I would never do on my own. Daniel Dennett, in his critical book of religion, it's not completely critical, it's an interesting book on religion, basically says that the hardest thing for him to get his hand around when he's trying to explain religion is the absolute power it has to transform people's lives, to do unbelievably selfless things. He thinks that is part of what needs to be explained if you're going to try to explain religion. And so I'm drawing on a couple of things. Our symbolic capacities, the fact that we posit divine beings that have these capacities and that we're capable of using our religious traditions to be transformed into the image of that which we idealize.
Great. Maybe I'll pose the last question that would get us a little bit more specifically into the Jewish dimension, because what you gave us is a paradigm for the emergence of religions for all human beings. But the two people who influenced you and really got you going academically are two Jewish sociologists / anthropologists, right? Emil Durkheim and Roy Rappaport. So can you tell us a little bit more about those two figures? And does it matter that they were Jewish or of Jewish descent, however you want to call it? What kind of Judaism did they bring into the conversation? So what about the Jewishness of those two researchers?
Yes, question. So there's a lot in that question. So I'll try to keep it relatively straightforward to say what was powerful about both of them. And I'm talking about Emil Durkheim 100 years ago and Roy Rappaport maybe 30, 40 years ago. They both, obviously Emil Durkheim is dead, Roy Rappaport is dead. What both of them emphasized was a much more embodied approach. What religion actually means. It is not something theoretical primarily. It's not something experiential primarily, even though they both felt like the experiment. In fact, I think the hidden key to both of them is they actually did prioritize the experience in an interesting way. But on the face of it, they were not about having an experience that confirmed a metaphysical truth. So, for example, in a Christian perspective, which is much more concerned with the truth of the theology, the experiences are supposed to defend something. They're supposed to prove something. Whereas both Durkheim and Rappaport, and I think it's because of their Jewishness, right? Much more looking at a community whose traditions have maintained themselves over long periods of time, and who have created value, and something about the religious tradition has crystallized value, as well as providing a medium for meaningful transformation for the individuals who are participant in them. That was what I was just talking about. A very different emphasis than a traditional Christian, and I'm writing with big brushstrokes here, but it was precisely this Jewish embodied approach that captured me. And what actually captured me most was a question that one of my mentors at BU, who was a Jewish scholar, who was teaching in Jewish studies, in talking about Emil Durkheim, he pointed out something that Emil Durkheim said, which was, there is no difference between, something that Durkheim said at one point in the book. There's no difference between the celebrations of something like the 4th of July and some significant event in the life of the nation, and the experience of people in a religious tradition. There's no difference there. We're talking about the same thing. And something struck me about that as being really wrong, but really interesting at the same time, because what he was pointing to was this capacity of ritual to form and create social structure and conform and create people to work within that social structure. And then to have the emotions and experiences that supported that social structure. That was kind of the outline of his perspective. But then he kind of at times seems to confuse politics with religion. And it was my job. In fact, I would say my entire life project at this point in my career has been to disambiguate politics from religion in Emil Durkheim. And Roy Rappaport takes an important step in doing so, and also, though, pushing forward in Durkheim's agenda. So it's, again, there's something very Jewish about both of them that has been so, and also led me to think about emergence theory, embodied approaches where I wouldn't be thinking in terms of emergence theory if I hadn't come across Emil Durkheim, who, by the way, was an emergentist. When he uses sui generis, I don't know how to say that in Latin, but sui generis, whatever it is, he uses that phrase a lot. He's actually adopting an early term in emergent theory thinking to try to capture his idea that religion is something that emerges. And I have whole chapters on books about this. But the point is, that's a Jewish conception of reality that I have adopted and I can't go back on.
Great, thank you. I think we have last, is there one more questions in this, in the Q&A?
No.
Oh, just a thank you. Great. So with that wonderful comment from Francois Mirguet, another professor of Jewish studies at ASU, thank you very much for this thorough answer. So with this, I'm going to thank the audience and I'm going to thank our speaker, Dr. Paul Cassell, for a very stimulating and exciting lecture that we don't often think about those issues from this particular perspective. So thank you for joining us, and do keep coming to the public lectures on Zoom this year. We have several more coming up in November and December. We look forward to seeing you. So thank you and have a good evening.